So we're in ordinary time, which in an earlier time in the church would have been thought of not as ordinary time, but as the first week after Pentecost. And while I love the idea of ordinary time, of the regular working of the gospel, I also still have a soft spot for the idea of this being the week after Pentecost, the week where we take what we learned on Sunday about the presence of the Holy Spirit in the church and start thinking about how that works in the in and out of our ordinary, the in and out of our day-to-day lives. And today's readings give us a sense of where the Holy Spirit shows up outside of Pentecost or in addition to Pentecost. If Sunday we heard about the Holy Spirit coming in big fire, tongues of fire, and a big wind, and dramatic languages and gifts, in today's readings we get a little bit more of a clue about where the Holy Spirit shows up in a smaller way. So I want to think a lot about our first reading, which is the story about Elijah from Kings showing up with the widow of Zarephath. We don't even get her name, but this woman of faith, this woman that God chose, and it's a wonderfully dramatic little story. There's a drought happening, and Elijah is moving around trying to find shelter, gets to this city called Zarephath, and meets this woman who was outside gathering sticks outside the gates of the city. And he asks her, could you bring me some water? Sure, she brings some water. Can you bring me some food? And she's finally like, as the Lord lives, I have nothing. I am getting some sticks to build a fire, to make my last meal for me and my son. And then as the text says, and after we have eaten it, we shall die. That understatement. And I think I want to stay with that dryness and that desperation, right? Drought, absence of water, absence of life, absence of food, absence of daily bread. And here she is, a widow with a son. So what's worse than being in the midst of a regional drought and food insecurity, but being already on the margins in the middle of a regional drought and food insecurity? And this random guy shows up asking you to give the little bit you have. For many of us, and at least for me, I feel a lot of commonality with that widow right now. I don't share the depth of her suffering. I don't claim to share the depth of her suffering. But that sense that after 2.5 years of COVID, feels like 2.5 years, 2 years, 3 months of COVID, of just being out of gas. All I've got left is a little bit of flour and a little bit of oil, and I don't want to do much more. We live in a country where children are being slaughtered by gun violence. We live in a country with the realities of structural racism and other forms of structural injustice that's been pushing. And I, as a white man, am safe and privileged to not have to endure most of that unless I choose to enter into solidarity. But the reality of that drumbeat of a world that seems harder every day is part of our reality in this moment in June 2022. We live in a world that's still at war. The war in Ukraine, but also all the other forms of violence that are in our world and in our society. We're all dried out. We're all desperate. Or many of us are, at least. And it's in that dryness and desperation that the Holy Spirit sneaks in the person of Elijah. If the Holy Spirit comes in with guns blazing, with fires blazing on Sunday, here the Holy Spirit is coming in, sneaking through the cracks of this woman's pain, sneaking through the cracks of dried dirt, and coming and bringing new life, somehow. Remember, Elijah's the prophet who heard God not in the wind and not in the fire and not in the great earthquake, but in the still small whispering voice that went by him in the cave. And notice how the Holy Spirit, how the presence of God, the enlivening presence of God, shows up in this story. She shows up through an act of kindness, an act of hospitality, a small act easily forgotten of a woman giving the last bit she has left and sharing it with a stranger. That this way in which we want big plans to fix the world, and we need big plans to fix the world, and we can keep hoping and dreaming and crafting those. But this is a story about how the Holy Spirit is present in these tiny moments of kindness and love, especially love for a stranger, done by people whose tanks are empty, done by people whose hearts are already broken, that these little acts of love are still remembered by God, are still valued by God, are still rewarded by God, maybe not in ways that we expect, maybe not in ways that make sense in the moment or ever, but that somehow these little acts of the Holy Spirit breaking into our dryness, giving us coolness in the heat, giving us some more water in the drought, that is the continuation of Pentecost. That's the continuation of what the season that we started on Sunday. So my prayer for today is that we think about who are the Elijahs in our life who are trying to help us, coax us, guide us, ask us to give a little bit more with the help of the Spirit. Who are the widows of Zarephath in our life who are running on more empty than we are and need our help, need our grace, need us to be that still small voice of God in their lives? And how do we together, through these small, often overlooked, easily forgotten acts of love, slowly keep watering the fields and preparing the ground for the full harvest, for the full rainstorm, for the full monsoon that will be the outpouring of the Holy Spirit definitively and finally?